In our last video, we talked about beveling and filing. This video here, we're going to add the texture to the piece before we form it. But there's a couple of things we need to do before we add the texture to it. One is we need to sand it. We need to sand it with some 220. We talked about what 220 was in a previous video. 220 is one of the coarser emery papers. It's not the coarsest one we have. If you remember, 150 was the coarsest. We need to use 220 to get rid of any large, deep scratches that we might have in the surface before adding the texture, so that after we add the texture, we don't sand away the texture. So in this ring here, I'm going to add some letters, and I'm also going to add a little bit of hammered texture to it. I'm also sanding where the bevel is, so I'm sanding the edge. I'm sanding the top surface of the ring. I am not sanding the back at this point. I can do that later. Going back and forth, trying to stay in one direction. To sand that all up. And I got rid of pretty much all the scratches. Any deep scratches. There are still scratches in there, but those are 220 scratches, which will eventually be sanded out with 400. Okay, now I got to decide what I'm going to put on here. I've already decided I am going to put the word hope on here, because I hope that we all get back and are able to make these rings. So I'm going to stamp hope in there. So what I'm going to do with a marker is I'm going to go over and I'm going to draw that in there. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of lines here and here, and then from this part over, I'm going to do a little bit of hammer texture. All right, so now it's time to do some stamping. Okay, I've got a couple of hammers here. I have a ball peen hammer. That's what I'm going to use to put the texture in. I also, the stamping texture in. I also have a cross peen hammer with polished ends. That's what I'm going to use to put the hammer texture in. Now, at school, typically we use a brass mallet to put the texture in, but we can use a ball peen hammer, but it must be a metal hammer to make sure we get a firm and deep enough imprint. So these are my letters. I'm going to start with the H. I'm going to make sure it's positioned properly. I'm going to set it right down on top of there, right on top of where I'm going to stamp, and I'm going to try to hit this firmly once. And now I've got the imprint in there. So the next letter, O, set that where I have it sketched or drawn, making sure it's in the proper position, and then stamp. P. If your letters move a little bit out of a straight line, it's okay. You have to remember that this will be curved around a finger, so you don't often notice those imperfections. The things you do notice is if you don't stamp the letters properly, meaning they're upside down or sideways or backwards, or if you don't have a good enough imprint. So I put it firmly down on the ring and then tap it once. If you tap it multiple times, you run the risk of getting a double image. All right, now I'm going to put the lines on either side of the word. Now I have this stamp right here. It's actually longer than the line I want to make. So if it's longer than the line you want to make, what you can do is you can set it down where you want to make that mark and then tilt it up so only part of it touches. And then I can make that mark there, come over to this other side here, and now I have the 2 marks on each side. Now, if I want to see what this looks like, all I have to do is sand a little bit to get rid of the marker marks, and that's my stamping. Now I'm going to put the hammered texture in on each side. So I'm going to use the ball peen hammer to do that. I'm going to start at those little lines that I made, and I'm going to start hammering. I want the hammer marks to touch one another. I don't want separation in between it because I want the surface to look hammered over the entire surface of the ring. Now in this case, I'm leaving that very end alone because I don't want the edges to distort too much. When I bend it around, I want to make sure that it's easy enough for me to file the seam, the end seam, and get it to fit together. I can always add this hammered texture to that part right along the seam after it's been soldered. And that is our finished textured ring right there. Tomorrow what I'm going to do is show you how we form it. At this point it's kind of curved a little bit, so it's been work hardened, so we're going to have to anneal it prior to forming it.